In February 2020, I presented at the Women's Caucus for Art's National Convention about the power of art and healing. Afterward, I did a piece using my mom's snapshots that I'd been cutting up and painting on. However, this time I was using them as silhouettes, or as a stencil. I was thinking about the statistics of getting cancer in my family, and I was working out the ratios of women and breast cancer. I did a piece called Still Here. That was on February 20th. On March 15th, I entered my studio as the official quarantine began. I declared my intention on Instagram to create and post a new piece of art every day during the quarantine. I wrote, "Even though I started this series before the outbreak, it seems more meaningful during this crazy time." People started responding that my figures were not socially distanced. Our perceptions were already changing, and our ideas about being close together were suddenly tainted with fear. Day 7 of quarantine work. Today is calmer, but no internet, no cable, and limited cell service. What lessons should we be learning? There are too many things we take for granted seems to be a biggie. Thankfully, I have my art/studio to escape to when I feel overwhelmed. Day 40 of quarantine work. There is a monotony to our routines in life, exaggerated by this time of staying home. There are fewer routes to walk and less or no places to go. But still, each day brings something new. #art, #expressionism. Part of my challenge was that I had to use materials found in my studio without buying new supplies. I had a box of paper gifted to me by the late artist Judith Roth's family, and that connection was particularly inspiring. Cutting out silhouettes and figures, rolling paint on paper was meditative, and the blending of the colors was soothing. The fear of illness and the risks we take to avoid getting sick have infiltrated my work for years. Now, the reporting of statistics of illnesses were an everyday occurrence, bombarding our news minute by minute. Each day I posted on Instagram, I wrote a short comment or reflection on the day. Some days it was COVID-19 related, some days it was a response to the politics of the time, and some days it was insight into the piece itself. I hadn't known when I started that as the days would pass and turn into weeks, I was creating and leaving a visual record with a kind of journal-like entry to mark this unique time. On May 31st, I wrote, "Today marks the end of the stay at home. It's my 78th piece on my 56th birthday. As of today, I am opening the series to sell each piece for $100, but $25 will go to the Art Center Highland Park where I work, and $25 will go to the charity of your choice." Today, the world is upside down. Our country is burning, and I'm confused and saddened. But throughout this time, I've tried to remain hopeful and will remain hopeful as long as there are people who are willing to fight for what is right. Today is a new beginning, and we cannot look forward until we see what is behind us, so that there can be true change. I also believe that art has the power to heal. I believed that phase 2 was lifting and that the quarantine was lessening. Therefore, I planned to mark the quote-unquote end of quarantine, and in honor of my birthday with the sale to purge myself of this work, I felt freer. But what I learned on June 1st was that nothing really changed. I still wasn't going to grocery stores or pharmacies. I still wasn't seeing my huge extended family or my kids who live out of state. In the next few weeks, there were incremental changes, and I was finally able to see family at a distance, outside. On Father's Day, I wrote that I hugged my sister and I held my great niece. That was considered a remarkable day. On June 23, I created Day 100, stating, As Chicago moves into phase 4, there remains a value of insecurity, of unknowns, with mixed ideas of what reopening even means. The subtlety of new normals is set against the drastic changes in our lives." Unquote. I had learned to value my time in my studio as the silver lining of quarantine taught me how to prioritize my time. I stopped picking out my fruits and vegetables, and I dealt with glitches to the food deliveries. However, all that enabled me to spend more time in my studio and to do my work, quote unquote, from home. My husband, who traveled most of our marriage, was home too, as well as 2 of my adult children, which meant we all would meet in the kitchen to cook together. There was joy during this time too. As we broadened our quarantine bubble to include extended family, outdoors of course, but with that came new stressors. Each day I continued to post, and often people responded to the changes, the growing number of people in the images, or the transitions of color. As the world moved into protest mode, I created a piece to honor the injustice, to honor the movements. I responded to the politics, to the election, to the death of Ruth Bader Ginsburg. I wrote about women's rights and my fears. I described in both images and words how it felt to be in the midst of a world pandemic. Each day there was both the stillness of being at home and a chaos of uncertainty. We were on shaky ground that questioned our normal routines. Would our lives go back to the crazy schedules of the past? Would I go back to the art center to install exhibits in person? And what would that even look like? We were planning for a new normal. What I was sure of is that I would try to continue on my drive and desire to create a piece every day, to mark my days with creative process that would be both healing and would reflect a universal condition of the effects of impending illness. In many of the posts, I wrote down my worries, my confusion. I seemed to connect my moods to the weather and to the things outside of my control. I repeatedly remarked about how our sense of time was skewed. On day 121 of quarantine work, I wrote, "I began this piece thinking about the faint existence during this time. Then I realized how confused I felt. The amount of unknowns and the feeling of isolation leave me feeling down. I am still in fear of breaking the quarantine and going out, but am I alone in those fears? What are we supposed to be doing or not doing? Shouldn't we wear masks? But are people wearing them with their friends? It's all so confusing, right?" I started on this piece with one intention, and 4 hours later, it was entirely different. The reality of loss is real in my family. For generations, the women in our families have passed too young, too suddenly. For more than 30 years, my work has been connected to family and to hereditary cancer, to the body with its strengths and vulnerabilities, and to the balance of health and disease. I've written endlessly about how the risk of disease has run through generations. This series has connected my story to a greater collective one. It reflects more than a year of a pandemic, more than 4 years of a brutal president, more than a lifetime of studying the human condition of facing our mortality. This series is evidence of the intersection between ourselves and the world around us. We keep hearing on the news, quote, "In isolation, we are all in this together." We were, and we weren't. I felt deeply my sense of privilege in my home, surrounded by family. I was alone, and I was not alone. I was lonely, and I wasn't lonely. Looking back, it seemed so much clearer to see the roller coaster that our lives had become. On day 161 of quarantine work, I wrote, "I contemplated ending posting every day after returning from Madison. However, now, after being in a college town, I'm going to lay low for the next few days and then get tested. So it's not even close to being over, as every day there's a new drama. It seems like things are normal, until someone who you know tests positive or someone's kid has to come home from college during the first week. It seems never ending. Shortly after posting that, my own daughter was diagnosed with COVID-19. On day 200, I wrote, 200 days since the pandemic changed our lives. 200 days of a pandemic. 200 days of working through the ups and downs of what our lives are like. We are not still in a stay-at-home order, yet our lives are not back to quote-unquote normal. Last night we had dinner plans, and we sat huddled around our fire pit, eating our dinner out of the carry-out containers they came in. Things are not exactly normal. 200 days of the constant worry and fear of not just contracting an illness, but of getting the contact tracing call. 200 days of constant news flowing about statistics with so much uncertainty. 200 days of unknowns. 200 days of changing viewpoints and interpretations of facts. 200 days of creating art that reflects the ups and downs, the tone and tenor, and the reality of life after. Shortly after this time, I began to use stenciled text in my work. On day 227, the piece states, "Words matter," and along with it I wrote, Day 227 of quarantine work. Words we speak matter. Words we hear matter. How we connect and disconnect to those around us are dependent on the words between us. On day 228, I painted fear and confusion. I wrote day 228 of quarantine work, an oxymoron in concept, but at the same time, it's how I feel. There is so much fear of the unknown of our future, but at the same time, I hold on to optimism. As the election grew nearer, the pieces screamed out to vote, to get involved, and they reflected my complete fear and anxiety. Day 231 of quarantine work, I wrote, I tried to do a piece about calm, but in anticipation of Tuesday's election, I'm so not calm. If you didn't vote early, vote. Day 233 of quarantine work. Hopefulness. The words surrounded by the silhouettes covered in blue. Putting positive energy out into the universe and hopeful for a better tomorrow. This isn't about political party affiliation. This is about morals and decency. This is about kindness and unity as a country. Time for healing. A few days later, I painted the text, Hope Rising, and I wrote, Day 235 of quarantine work, a glimmer of hope with a shimmer. No matter what happens in this crazy time in our country, it is confirmation of the differences of tone and tenor that continues. Just so hoping for change. Meanwhile, the pandemic continues to rage, and I see how much it's impacting our communities. It's time to focus on healing! ! 10 days later, I painted the word life, and I wrote day 244 of quarantine work. Life is filled with so many ups and downs and challenges. I feel like sometimes, some days you find yourself saying, it's just life. And then ironically, shortly after was the loss of Ruth Bader Ginsburg. I did two pieces. One, I painted the word empower, and the other, the words rising up. Day 256 of quarantine work, a piece inspired by @Ruth Bader Ginsburg, a perfect Thanksgiving post. A friend today sent a text to a group that said, enjoy and be grateful for whoever is at your table. It struck me that even though this is an unusual dinner and that my big, usual, loud family is not all together, our connections run far deeper than distance. For that, I am grateful. And on day 256, with the words "Rising Up," I wrote, "Another inspired by the small but mighty at RBG as we push forward, rise up, and persevere." Another 100 days passed, and then another. There were big moments, driving cross country to see my kids living in California, and then driving back into the cold isolation of Chicago. I can't believe looking back that day 400 passed without much mention. I added to the title Days of Quarantine and Its Aftermath because we were in limbo, living under a constant cloud of disease, including the fears around testing and exposure. I did not post when I got vaccinated because I was afraid even then around the fury around vaccination. Who was supposed to get those highly coveted shots and who was waiting patiently for their turn? On May 16, 2021, there was nothing special, nothing particularly different to mark the end of the pandemic. Things were edging towards normalcy, and my life was returning to routines, although differently for sure. I kept saying I would know when I was done. I would feel it, or I would just sense an end to this over a year-long endeavor, marking this phase in history. I wrote, "I've always said that I'd know when I'd be done, and as I'm visiting my son and his wife on the precipice of becoming parents, I'm feeling like I want to be present. As I become a grandmother for the first time, and as the country moves towards normalcy, I'm realizing I'm no longer quarantined. The worry and fears are disappearing. Most of our family is vaccinated and life is moving forward. I'm grateful that this series was able to help occupy my time and guide our reactions, but I think I'm ready to move on. I'm sure I'll still be influenced by this series, but let's see what the future holds. Thanks for all of you who have followed me during this journey." Heart emoji. And that was it. I look back at the days, all 425 of them, and I remember each piece like a part of a puzzle, like the many puzzles we were doing during the quarantine. I remember the upheaval after George Floyd's murder, the sadness of Ruth Bader Ginsburg's death, the anxiety of the election, the relief of Biden's win, and all of the days in between of life in quarantine, of the complete shift in our everyday lives, the fears, the worry, the quiet connections with ourselves. This video blurs the boundaries between myself and the history we were living. Like all of my work, it addresses how health and disease affects our lives, from the threat of cancer to COVID's global pandemic. When we face our mortality, we find meaning, because out of the darkness, we also find light.